I'm Canadian. I was born in Toronto, and my childhood was a typical middle-class childhood in Toronto. I went to public schools, went to a high school that was very formative for me for research ethics because I ran into Marty Greenberg. Marty Greenberg was my grade 12 biology teacher, who was famous for several things, including dressing up like the Krebs cycle, walking in and displaying what cell function looked like in a costume. And Marty was very influential because he asked us to write a paper about anything in the field of bioethics, which at that time, this is the mid-70s, was a very fledgling field. And I wrote about in vitro fertilization, which hadn't really happened yet. I wrote the paper before Louise Brown was born and thought that was kind of interesting. The rest of my childhood was a typical childhood for someone in a family that was fairly politically active, politically informed. Probably that was one of the more influential parts of growing up in a family with two parents and having discussions at the dinner table about the issues of the day.
So how many siblings did you have?
One sibling, an older brother who actually lives in Boston. And the idea was if you weren't participating in the family discussions around the table, you'd just be eating, and that was kind of boring. So,
well, what did your parents do? What were you?
Well, it's a fascinating little background, but my parents, who've now been married 61 years and are still alive and going strong, come from a very, we might call them left-leaning political background, and they were involved in lots of things. My mother went to law school late in life, they called them mature students then, and took her law degree, didn't practice law, but decided to work in the provincial government in many different positions relating to civil liberties and human rights. My father, who did not go to college, took on a number of roles. I mean, he ran a small business for many, many years and got quite bored with that, and then moved into the field of adjudication, in the field principally related to medicine and health, and that was sort of accidental, not intentional. So he sat on the discipline committee of the Ontario College of Physicians and Surgeons and watched how docs would be brought before a panel and assessed for their ethical competence. So my parents were very, and are very formative role models in my life for things like social justice and civil liberties. It was an active atmosphere. Active because for us, argument was not something that was ad hominem. Argument was something that you tried out and practiced. Making an argument, trying out ideas, not being told that you're stupid or told that your ideas didn't have merit. That didn't happen at our table. Our table is, what do you think about whatever it might have been? You know, the Prime Minister of Canada just introduced the War Measures Act because there are terrorists in Quebec. What do we think's going on there?
You took that attitude to school with you? How did your teachers respond?
Well, Meslins aren't shy, but I'd like to think we're fairly respectful of different points of view. And I think that was the key going into different junior high and high school situations. I mean, I went to a junior high, which was sort of a progressive junior high. Open plan at the time. This was very progressive in Canada. No walls in the junior high and taking labs in various places. So I don't think that it was all that odd to be talking about ideas all throughout my early schooling years.
Were you a studious kid?
Yeah, I was pretty studious.
Yeah.
Studious and I wouldn't dignify it by calling it a formal growing up in terms of my training, but I did a lot of sports and I did a lot of music as well, so that sort of well-rounded side. I was a good, I would say good to very good student, but I was not the best student in any of my classes. So I played volleyball for starting in junior high and all the way through university, but as you might be able to see, I'm somewhat height challenged. So my expertise was in setting and in playing defense.
Somebody has to set.
Yeah, somebody has to set.
Come on.
So, but what's interesting about volleyball? Two things. Thing one is it's a team sport, so it's not like golf or tennis. And I enjoy being on a team. I don't have to be the captain of the team. I don't have to be by myself. I enjoyed the team aspect of it. And the other thing is that playing college level sports in Canada is very different from the US. There are no scholarships. It's not a commercial activity. You play because you love it. So I played volleyball all the way through university, through 2 knee surgeries, and then I went to graduate school. So volleyball was an important formative part of my growing up as well. The field of bioethics was so fledgling at the time, and again, I come back to my parents who were very supportive. I had a university philosophy teacher. I started off in political science as an undergrad. Why? Because that had to do with society and rights, and like I thought I might go to law school. But I ran into a philosophy prof who said there's this topic called medical ethics. You might want to try it out, and I did. But there was no idea that this is what you will be, because there wasn't any job listing at that time. I had a political science professor who bought me Bob Veach's book, A Theory of Medical Ethics, as a gift, unsolicited. This is a class of 300 people. He heard I was interested in bioethics, and he bought this book, and I read it cover to cover. And therein lies the tale. I wrote to Bob and said, you have no idea who I am. I'm this undergrad student in Canada, and I just read your book. Could I come and talk to you? He's like, sure. Drove to Georgetown, talked to Bob, talked to Leroy Walters. I mean, some of it was serendipity, some of it was a little bit of chutzpah, some of it was, coincidence. Well, growing up again in Canada in a fairly progressive family, this is the time when south of the border, Richard Nixon was all the rage. So if you sort of put yourself in the position of someone who's raised in a family whose parents both worked for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, which is the Canadian equivalent of the American Civil Liberties Union, and watching what's going on in Vietnam and watching what's going on with the Nixon White House, you can't help but be influenced by that big behemoth to the south of us. And yet, probably like most Canadians, the idea of the U.S. is this bizarre love-hate thing. It attracts you and it repels you, and it was a very intriguing time, the late 70s, growing up, late 70s, early 80s. I mean, I marched outside the U.S. consulate in Toronto during the Vietnam War. I was a little kid, but those events were pretty seminal. I was never interested in science for its own sake. I was always interested in the role that science played in society. And research, principally health research, not physics research, not chemistry, but the health sciences always attracted me. And I think the connection for me was always that science and technology had this ability to alleviate human suffering. I mean, it was sort of a fundamental tenet, not so much of how I was raised, but I think it was, in the oatmeal that I ate most days, that, in a country like Canada's, which at that time still has a phenomenal national healthcare system, whereas the U.S. didn't, playing in the area of research was a way to get science to the people in a way that might help.
Did you have friends who were similarly interested in this, or were you the...
No, I was really the odd duck. I mean, most people, certainly when I was growing up, my colleagues, my friends, would either be taking sort of normal university careers and moving on to be lawyers or doctors or accountants, or none of the above. But the bioethics was a very odd thing. And in some ways, it's almost like evolutionary winnowing. I just kept at it. There were a lot of colleagues and friends that I had even at Georgetown who stopped. Many of them continued and are really leaders in the field today. We were at that very unique time, the mid to late 80s, which was a huge bubble of pretty impressive people. I mean, some really impressive people, a lot of whom are in this meeting and are in the field. Center directors, Jeff Kahn, Rob Olick, Nancy Cass. I mean, just at Georgetown, Jeff and Rob and Sue Rubin, Dave DeGrazia. I mean, that's a pretty interesting bioethics team that you could put on the floor and hold your own against a lot of other teams. So we had a pretty good group then, and that it goes back to that volleyball thing you asked me about. There was a kind of a cooperative team of bioethics people in the mid to late 80s at Georgetown. I was a summer graduate student, and thanks go to Leroy Walters for setting that up. I had just been at Georgetown for a semester when my interest in research ethics kind of started to develop. And I don't know the entire backstory, but Leroy had suggested me to Charlie, and I went and met him on the NIH campus, which is, of course, a mind-blowing experience. I mean, I'm not trying to make more of this than it is, but there is the bit of that Canadian insecurity. You go to an American university, that's not a lot of people got to do that. And I went to Georgetown University, which at that time was Patrick Ewing and the basketball team. It was a big deal university. And I kept pinching myself the whole time I was there. Is this really, and there's Tom Beecham and Leroy Walters and Ed Pellegrino, and really? I mean, so that was pretty, it took a while to get over that. And then along comes, would you like to work at the NIH? You're like, the NIH? The one in Bethesda? And of course, Charlie was, the kind of person who is a very influential figure in so many people's lives, and they may not know it. I've taken a lot of time to think about how influential he's been, and I probably haven't fully appreciated it, because here's a guy who took a risk. It wasn't a huge risk. I was a graduate student, so I wasn't a complete, a complete risk. And he essentially threw me into the mix, participating in workshops, drafting memos, looking up new information. And that's 5 years after the Belmont report was written. And we're going to meetings and talking about implementing Belmont and implementing privacy protections, and talk about the imposter syndrome. I had it in spades. But Charlie, whose own history, as you probably know, is both charming and heartrending and fascinating. He once talked to me about his list of gracious people. Now, Charlie has a background in both theological studies and in the seminary. To have met his wife and then chosen Estelle over, it's one of the great love stories of all time, one of the absolute great love stories of all time. So to learn at his side how something as, this almost sounds simplistic, but something as obvious as, there's thinking about ethics and there's doing it. And at OPR, and it was OPRR then, an office that was just this tiny little office, but it was so powerful in its moral stance across the NIH and across the country. And he's in the office next door. And it's just, he'd come in and we'd chat about things, and Bill Dommel was still there, and Carol Wigglesworth. And some of the old timers were still, the folks who wrote the regs. I mean, Charlie was the guy who was in the room when it all happened. And one of our great misses was, as he retired, he asked me, which was very gracious of him, to jointly write a grant application to the National Library of Medicine, which was essentially to write a book about the history of OPRR. He said, I can't do it alone, you got to do it with me. He says, well, all these boxes, this is all in the pre-internet, pre-everything, and he had boxes of stuff in his basement. And he said, I need someone to help me go through the boxes, and you're the guy to do it, and we should write this. I said, well, I'll help you as your research. No, we're going to do it together. Wrote the grant application. It got a phenomenal score, and it wasn't funded. And it wasn't funded. A lot of people got quite upset about this. Leroy was especially upset. We never got the full story, but the rumor was that the National Library of Medicine was a little worried that it might be a sort of kiss and tell story about the NIH. So it was never written. Now, he has been trying to make up for that for years by writing chapters in books and textbooks, and he and I are in the middle of a chapter right now. It's overdue, but we're in the middle of a chapter right now. And I think he feels that he has to, I feel he has to do that, and he has to keep living until he has sort of disgorged the living memory that's inside his body. Because in our field, we spend way too much time thinking about the printed document, which is the result of the deliberation. You know, here's the regulation, here's the guideline, here's the whatever. But he was in the room when all the drafts were written and why something got changed. None of that even mattered in terms of his real impact. I mean, most people can write a history of research ethics just talking about his fingerprints on everything. But it was his character, and it was his moral being that just infused everything. You wanted to be like him. You knew you never could. You know, you wanted him to be your mentor if you could. I put him on my PhD committee. It was essential because I was writing about research ethics. But he is a person who he's also the kind of guy that if you haven't spoken to him for a week or a month or a year, you know, and you pick up the phone and it's, hi, how are you doing again? It's not, why didn't you call? And I've been expecting, and what, I mean, he doesn't like the old Jewish grandmother. He was actually your friend. So he started off as an iconic figure. He became a colleague. And I think my most important feeling about him is that he's a close friend. And he's a friend to, I'm sure a lot of people can say that. I'm not in any way unique, but he probably more than anyone else helped give me the vision for thinking about how you could apply this theoretical stuff we are learning into a career.
What do you think he saw in you that made him want to take that leap?
You know, when I say I don't know, I'm not trying to be modest, but I really don't know. I think as much as anything, it was that he trusted Leroy Walter's judgment. And Leroy, I could say very similar things about him in terms of his influence on me. And these are both really modest people. I mean, almost embarrassingly modest. So I think Charlie relied on Leroy's judgment. And then once, you know, it's like the interview. Once you get in the room, he figured he'd take a risk. And it was only for an extended summer. It wasn't a full-time position for 10 years. It's probably not unusual in our field when people get academic appointments to run programs. There are centers for bioethics all over the world. In North America, there's probably 100 of them. And although no two are exactly the same, there are a couple of, you know, phenotypes that are similar. And I fall into the phenotype of running a research center. So all the stuff that we do at my center is funded by the NIH or other sponsors. And the hat that I wear as director is to keep the merry band of researchers in my place happy. We write grants together, we publish together. The other hats are professorial hats. I'm also an endowed professor of bioethics. That's just simply a way of getting a bit of extra money into our center. And I'm an associate dean in the medical school. Someone told me when I got that title that I was the first or one of the first to have such a title. I'm not a big fan of those sorts of titles, but I was more impressed that my former dean, who is now since retired, thought that it was important enough to provide me with an administrative title that gave me, in a sense, unusual access to the leadership of the university. He only wanted assistant and associate deans to advise him. We didn't get any money for this, but it was, he added it to your business card. So the hats are not equally full. I probably have 3 or 4 academic, you know, professor of medical and molecular genetics, but that doesn't mean I'm an expert in medical and molecular genetics. My training, like many of my colleagues, was in philosophy, specializing in bioethics.
Then, So what do you do in your day? What is your physical activity?
You know, and I know you ask this of a lot of people, and, you know, the answer is always, well, it depends on the day.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if you could see my calendar, right? Mm-hmm. So on any particular day, and no 2 days will be the same, there will be a selection from the following cafeteria menu. Finishing, starting, editing a paper. Finishing, starting, editing a grant application that's due. Carrying out some kind of budget activity. As a center director, you have to be responsible for the money that comes in and goes out. Planning a conference, inviting colleagues to come to your center, doing performance appraisals for your staff, writing letters of recommendation for students, teaching classes, giving workshops. The list is, and that's all within Indianapolis. Then you can add to that, and doing many of those things in other places. So we have lots of collaborations with researchers around the world. I've just come back from a year-long sabbatical in France, which was a very nice thing to do, but it also produced an awful lot of collaborative work, so that's expanding. Again, the day that we're doing this interview, I have 4 graduate students from Eldoret, Kenya, who are part of a collaborative program that we run. They're at my university for 6 weeks to learn about research ethics. So that's and there's no 2 days will be the same, and I haven't even mentioned speaking to the media, which happens on a pretty regular basis. I think personally, I've been looking at my career the last little while. Depending on how you count numbers, I've sort of been in bioethics for 25 years or so, which sounds like a long time to me, but it's gone by very, very quickly. And I think for the most part, the early part of my career and my friends was spent developing our own bona fides. My mission was to write another paper or to get another grant, to prove to someone that I was a legitimate person, that I was no longer an imposter. And then at some point in that evolution, you start to think about other people. How can what I have done be translated to the next generation? So I like to think of myself I've divided things into thirds, and then into thirds again. There's a beginning and a middle and an end of your career, and each has a beginning and a middle and an end. I think I'm at the end of the middle of my career. Now, these are not equidistant, equal chunks. They're not all 10 years or 20 years in length. But I feel now that much of my, this is all about me, and I have to get another paper onto my CV because someone's going to evaluate me on the basis of something as silly as how many papers that no one reads is on this document called the CV. I've made peace with the fact that I'm never going to have 250 papers written. That's fine. It's kind of like that book, 1,000 Places to See Before You Die. I went through that book once and checked them all off, how many I'd seen. And I think I'd been to 247 places, which sounds like a lot. But then when you figure, in order to get to 1,000, I'm going to have to live to be 143. So get over the fact that you're not going to see 1,000 places. I've made peace with the fact that I'm not going to publish 150 papers or 250 papers. And I'm happy with that. But my mission is now more about what do we want the field to look like? Research ethics was a real, Wild West field in the early days. I like to think that some of the people you've interviewed who were my mentors were the first generation in the field. I mean, Charlie McCarthy was generation 1. Leroy Walters, Bob Levine, these were the Tom, these are the founders of the field in many ways. They created research ethics, at least domestic American research ethics, and ironically, they've also been seen as the founders in some other places around the world. So I'm either the second generation or maybe the third, depending on how you count things. And I keep watching what these guys have been doing, and they haven't let up. They're still contributing to the field. They're still trying new ideas. And I feel that my mission is to keep going and to expand the field in some ways. Expand because it's not only about IRBs and informed consent. It's not only about the risk benefit. And I spent an entire PhD on risk judgments and why IRBs can't do them very well. And that was an interesting little niche. But the world of research ethics is now so broad, I can't even get my arms around all of it. It extends into national security, it extends into labor policy, into humanitarian intervention. It's a massive field. So I'm trying to think of how the field is going to grow and what kind of expertise we're going to need in it for the next generation.
And so at the end of this second third, you're trying to figure out how to expand this field?
Well, it's not just
the next third is the expansion part.
Well, this is, because you're asking a little bit about me, I will tell you that there's a certain amount of dissatisfaction with what I've accomplished so far. Because a lot of us, at least I know that I went into this, to borrow the tired phrase, to make some kind of difference. I wasn't sure what the difference was that I was trying to make, mind you. It just seemed that the field had a wonderful blend of political reform and social awareness, coupled with the ability of science to promise a lot and raise some challenges. That was really exciting, and we didn't have to decide what we wanted the field to be like or our role in it. Everything counted. Sitting on IRBs, writing papers, running the LC program for a couple of years, it's all good. But now I feel a bit more of a stewardship responsibility for what the field could do. I mean, in a way, we spent a lot of the first 15, 20 years I did knocking on the door. Are we allowed to come into your room and make a difference? Well, they let us in. In fact, they're inviting us in now. They're expecting us to be in the room. So there's a bit of an obligation to think about what the legacy of the field's going to be 15, 20 years from now. And I would like to be able to make some kind of difference in the next 10 or 20 years. I'm not sure what it's going to be. I'm really not sure what it's going to be. Ooh, that's a... Should he lower his voice when he says the future? But honestly, to do the same thing, I will just speak very, very, personally. I either have a short attention span, or I just love having a lot of balls in the air. So some of the balls are already being picked up very nicely by an entire new generation of researchers who know more about a lot of the issues that I used to study than I do now. And I'm delighted that we can fill an entire conference center, a convention center with people. But I do think that the field of research ethics is at risk of stagnating if if we get too complacent, then we're going to be talking about IRBs and informed consent for another 20 years. For me, that's boring. Honest to goodness, it's boring. I'm much more interested in pushing some of the boundaries into areas that are not, strictly speaking, contained within the old-fashioned definition of research ethics, research involving human subjects. So I'm sort of admitting or confessing to a kind of uncertainty about my future, but also about the future of the field, if it even is a field. It's so large now; it's larger than a field.
Do you have are you worried about anything for the future of the field?
I'm not. I think the quote the field, as defined by lots of graduate programs, medical humanities programs, research ethics programs, Priminar's work, bioethics commissions, the field's in pretty good hands in terms of the capacity that we're building. There's a lot of capacity being built, master's programs and students getting trained. But for the most part, the field was a responsive field. We were responding to issues and trying to help. Belmont Report responding to a set of issues in some ways. The federal regs responding to a set of issues. The challenge, I think, for field is deciding where is it going to go, and do we want to simply wait for the next thing to happen? Do we want to get out in front of it before it does, or do we just kind of want to, double down and place our bets on red and black and say, well, we'll be prepared for new things, but meanwhile, we'll also run bioethics centers. I really don't know. And I have to say that some of my skepticism is not so much about things internal to the field as much as it is about the way that society is organizing itself. I'm shocked and depressed that we're still having debates about the teaching of evolution in this country. I mean, it's depressing, to be perfectly honest. Sad, sobering that here we are. It's 2013, almost 2014, and we're having that conversation. Or climate change, we're having that conversation, really. So my worry is not so much about me or the field as much as what society is going to be doing and whether it's going to care about science. We weathered the Bush administration storm for 8 years, and it was a really tough period to watch, the most powerful country in the world dismiss a lot of science as being, well, just some facts, but we don't have to worry about the facts because we've got some policy to worry about. That was upsetting. It's upsetting to see science being debated as maybe not so relevant for the curriculum in certain states. And this is politics writ large. This is the future of, the future of the planet in some ways. We're still talking about the relevance of science, for goodness sakes. How sad. On the other hand, there's so much energy, and science itself doesn't really pay attention to what society thinks. Things are happening on a fairly regular basis now. But I'm not depressed as in go and hide under a rock. I think I'm just a bit more mindful of where we are right now as opposed to 25 or 30 years ago. We knew what the agenda was 25 or 30 years ago. There are issues around science and technology that were challenging. We didn't have a governance system for figuring it out. The heroes like Charlie McCarthy and Bob Levine and Leroy Walters and others came along and said, look, we can apply these tools of bioethics to real social problems, and we all jumped on that bandwagon. In some ways, I feel that there's no way that we can do what those guys and women did. Ruth Faden and Ruth Meslin. The list is pretty long and distinguished of the giants in the field. Little Ruth Meslin has moved mountains with her work. Because I was thinking about that issue, the kind of not so much the digital divide, but just the simple issue of the internet and email. When I worked at the American Psychological Association after OPRR and before I finished my PhD, that was one of the first times that I had email. And it was a very interesting and sort of quaint little tool. It wasn't an instrument of reason. The internet was non-existent. So this was the 1984, 85. It was sort of a quaint little tool that some people might play with. But we still went to the Library of Congress to look things up, in the stacks, and we went to big libraries that had books on shelves. And I feel like I'm aging myself, but that's that divide between before and after. I lived through that divide, and I think my generation can probably appreciate, like no other, what it was like to not have that tsunami of information available at your fingertips, and then to have it available to you at your fingertips. It was pretty hard to make sense of the difference, of the power of that difference, until you were literally faced with, I can now look something up from my desktop that I had to go down to Lowinger Library at Georgetown and wait in line and go up to the third floor and down the hall and on a shelf. That whole way of thinking and doing research has changed. And my kids, my daughter humorously reminded me of this experience. She went into a library at Indiana University in Bloomington, the actual physical library, and thought it was a really cool place, because they had books there. And this is a 4.0 student. She's going to do great things in her life. But the idea of a building that stores books on shelves almost seems comical to us now. Why would you waste entire buildings just so that a book can sit there forever, except for the 2 minutes when someone takes it out, or the week that someone takes it out? That space could be put to so much use. But to go back to your point about the information, I call it tsunami. There's just so much. I worry a little bit about our capacity to make our way through that mountain, because it's happening so quickly. I mean, stuff is happening. the proverbial, I read the story about red wine, it's good for you this week, and I read a story tomorrow and it's bad for you, that the discriminating ability to understand the science is gone. And sadly, our news media lack any capacity for discriminating good studies from bad studies. They're now entertainment entities, not real analytic organizations. So I worry about how the information avalanche or tsunami is going to affect our ability to think about ethical issues. I mean, I really do. If you can have a student who in 5 minutes can go onto Google Scholar and find 5 papers that span the gamut from supporting a topic, stem cell research, to opposing it, and they assume that those papers are equally useful because they're published in a journal. I worry because there isn't that time between reading something, thinking about it, talking about it with other people. We don't have the coffee pot, water cooler discussion as much as we used to. And I think that's because we're sitting in front of our tablets and our computers, and we're texting people and telling them, I read this really interesting thing about, the meteorite that exploded over Russia last year. There's a new paper in Nature. I also worry about the feeling of inferiority that people have when they haven't kept up with that avalanche. No human being on this planet can keep up with the literature. I don't care. They can't even keep up with the tables of contents that you can get, which is a cheating way of finding out what's in the literature. And I think what I worry about most is that will cause a kind of backlash, almost a regression towards ignorance. You say, you know what, I can't keep up with all that, so I'm just not going to read it. I can't. I'll read a snippet. I'll read a news account, and that's a little frightening, that we might slowly become stupider because we're just overwhelmed by all the info.
If you look at the world, the Earth, as a global research community, do you think that there is one set of bioethical rules or one framework that is equally applicable?
So my youngest daughter asked me, you're asking all these personal questions, literally 3 weeks ago. This is the high school senior who's taking a course called Theory of Knowledge, and they're studying different epistemological approaches to knowing things. And they were on the unit called ethics. So she thought, I've got an expert at home, so I can at least test out some of my ideas. And she came home, Hallie Rose is her name, and she said, so do you think there are any are ethics universal? And I said, yes. And she said, good, I got that one right. And we had a long, it was, I say it humorously because this is going to be recorded for posterity and I don't want her to be embarrassed. But it was a very important, for me, question to be asked. And my initial answer is, yeah, at certain levels, we are in a global, whether we go back to Van Rensselaer Potter and whether his definition of bioethics, really the ethics of the planet, is what we're talking about. I have a certain sympathy for that idea, that there are certain ethical precepts and ideas that are human, that have to do with who we are occupying the planet. Some of them are pretty easy, that I think most people would agree that harming others is ethically wrong. I think most people would agree that slavery is wrong. And it's not a question of the relativism of all these things. Well, in this country, it's okay to do this and not. I'm hoping that in the next 20 or 30 years, we will probably work without borders in ethics. There really does need to be an ethics without borders initiative. Many of us are involved in work in different countries, and we see this on a regular basis. Ironically, we also see people in other countries adopting almost uncritically American bioethics ideas. They've read Tom Beecham and Jim Childress's famous book, Principles of Biomedical Ethics. I was at a meeting in Johannesburg, South Africa, giving a talk about research ethics about 10 years ago. And a gentleman got up and asked me a question. He said, I'm from Ghana, and I've just finished reading the 3rd edition of Beecham and Childress, and I found chapter 4 to be very different from the previous version. Dr. Meslin, what do you think about the difference between edition number 2 and edition number 3 of Beecham and Childress's Principles of Biomedical Ethics? And this was a gentleman from Ghana at a meeting in Johannesburg, South Africa, which is kind of the flip side of, are there any universal ethical principles, any universal ethical ideas? Yes, many of them have to do with human security and safety and integrity. But then here's someone who's read somewhat in a very detailed way, almost a content analysis of arguably one of the more popular and well distributed books in the history of bioethics, and has adopted it almost as if it were his own mantra. So I think in some ways the long answer typically to the short question is there are things that are universal and absolutely must be. When Nuremberg spoke of crimes against humanity, it was speaking about something that was, if not self-evident, then certainly understandable. And if it was understandable and it could therefore become applicable, whether it's in a court or in an IRB or somewhere else, then I think we've got a little insight into the universality of certain ethical principles.
What is something that you are proud of, that you have accomplished, or a department or group of people you've worked with has accomplished?
Wow. I've got a pretty high bar for being proud about something, so I'm not sure that I've had a few wins, a few things that I'm happy about. I don't know if I go to proud, but
Right.
I have to say I was very pleased that that Harold Shapiro saw in me enough to ask me to be the executive director of NBAC. Why would they pick me? So I was pleased to be picked, but I was actually more proud of the work that the commission did. I mean, they really worked hard. Now everyone will say that about commissions that they've been with, but they really worked hard. And I was pleased that I could contribute at that time to some new ways. I mean, we made some policy decisions that I was pleased about. I guess it's a really hard question. You can see me struggling. I don't know that I'm especially proud. I have I'm not sure that I'm fully proud about anything just yet. I'll let you know in a year or so. But
Well, how about the other side? Is there something that you regret, or that you wish you could go back and do again because you know better now?
Well, maybe it sounds so corny to say I wouldn't change a thing, because the place that I'm at now would not have happened had it not been for the events in my life, including applying for the tenure track position at the University of Toronto, their bioethics position, which everyone assumed was a hands down, Meslin will get this, and I didn't. And one of my then graduate students, who then went on to become a very important bioethicist in his own right, Jim Lavery, who was the bioethicist at Fogarty, was my graduate student at the time. And I remember vividly him, using that line that many people have. And I thought, well, just a line. He said, this might be the best thing that ever happened to you, not getting that University of Toronto job. I mean, you were from Toronto. Everyone assumed you'd get the job, but didn't get it. And he was right. Had that not happened, I would not have gone to Oxford and set up a bioethics program at Oxford. I wouldn't have gone to the Genome Institute for a couple of years and learned about the Genome Project from the inside, which led to, and if it hadn't been McCarthy, hiring me at OPRR, I probably wouldn't have got the APA job. If I didn't have the APA job, I probably wouldn't have, gone to the NIH. If I hadn't gone to the NIH, I wouldn't have gone to NBAC. Hadn't gone to NBAC, I wouldn't have. So there's a kind of, I do tell myself the story that I wouldn't have changed much. I think there are some personal relationships that I could have handled better, or professional, not personal, professional relationships I could have handled better. And I think, age and maturity is, a a wonderful thing to have. You wish you had it earlier, but that's kind of ironic that you can't have it. But among the things that I'm probably most proud is that I'm still struggling with this question, you see, is the personal relationships. There's a lot of people that I enjoy knowing, and that takes work. But no, the kinds of things that you wish you could turn back the clock are more like, oh, if I had done a better job, it might not have been so bad, whatever the bad thing was.
We've kind of done a review of your whole life here. Can you?
That was pretty quick, see?
It was pretty
Yeah.
good. Can you now see or identify personal traits or skill sets that you have that have stood in good stead?
Well, one of the things, I think I'm starting to identify them, and I guess it goes back to the older, wiser bit. It should be no surprise by our interview that I do think that a certain amount of humor and ability to look on a lighter side has stood me in good stead in some pretty tricky situations. A lot of the issues that we've dealt with, certainly in places like the Genome Project or NBAC, were public bioethics activities, which where mistakes that are made publicly can be pretty devastating and embarrassing. And I think it's important to have a proper perspective. And I think I've learned to have some perspective on what's important and what isn't, to apply some humor. That's probably as much a defense mechanism for me as it is anything else. I think the other thing that's stood me in good stead, going back to my parents and really my friends throughout my life, is the appreciation of diversity, cultural diversity. I'm not a religious person, for example. My family background is Jewish, but I'm not theologically inclined. We don't practice. My wife is a Methodist, also non-practicing, and our family is essentially atheist. And what that has done in some ways is it has allowed me to look for the morality in people, not in a set of books or other pronouncements. And I'm almost morally obliged as I say that sentence to then say, but that's okay if other people want to do that. And you watch me do the kind of accommodation of difference. I rather like difference. I'm not frightened by it. I'm not put off by it. I have gained an appreciation of the diversity of humanity and the diversity of people in this field. Early in my career, I worked in hospital bioethics, doing bedside clinical ethics work, where you would see very strong religious values, very strong secular values, very strong professional values. Nurses crying at the surgeon who acted horribly and then would come into my office and say, can you do something about this? I don't know what I can do about a horrible surgeon, but to have a certain amount of empathy for people is something that we learned along the way. And I learned it from McCarthy. I learned it from Lyra Walters. I learned it from Ed Pellegrino, about whom I had so little in common. He, as a distinguished leader of our field, a strong Roman Catholic, but about whom I was so fond, because he was so different. I mean, I would never have met someone like Pellegrino probably in all my years. And here's a guy who wrote letters to the graduate students when he had to have the first of his 4 heart surgeries, apologizing for not being able to teach class. You learn that kind of, you learn a kind of, I wouldn't say charisma because it's more than that. It's a generous spirit, and it's a character that you know is authentic. So I would absolutely love having arguments with him because it was about the issue. It's something that we talk to our kids about as well, that I love arguing. I hate ad hominem. I hate when someone attacks me personally. I love it when you attack my argument, but I don't like being attacked as a person. Nobody does. So the ability to understand or distinguish between the quality of an argument and the quality of a person, I think stands people in good stead, and I'm still learning it.
Is there anything else that you would like to talk about?
Gosh, there's so many people, that had a role in little tiny roles, like Ruby Takanishi, who was the scientific affairs director at the American Psychological Association, this dynamo, 5 foot nothing, who taught me a lot about science and about, I would almost call it, the integrity of science. I was not a psychologist by training, and she probably single-handedly disabused me of any perception I might have had about what the field of psychology is from a science perspective. Not the clinical side was not what we were spending time on. So someone like Ruby Takanishi. There are other people who had strong influences, going all the way back to undergraduate professors. I learned in some sort of good ways what it's like to see a policy that you hope would have some impact on the world be thrown away and just sort of dismissed. And I learned that from none other than Bill Clinton. Now, it wasn't at me directly, but to watch the real world of policy as it unfolded inside the Beltway, when NBAC writes a report, finishes up a report, hasn't handed it in to the president yet, and we fly back from a meeting from Boston. Actually, we land at National, then called National Airport in Washington, and I get a text that the White House has rejected our stem cell report, the one that we hadn't even sent to them. And it took a lot of us by, this is a sort of a tangential comment, but it was learning, as proud as we might all be, or as impressed as we all think we are in working in the policy world of research ethics, we don't have a clue what the real world looks like when someone in the Domestic Policy Office or OSTP or the NIH makes a decision to have a policy go in a different direction. That was a wake-up call that was a cold slap in the face in some ways. But it was a learning experience. So you learn from failure, you learn from success, you learn from people. I'm still learning.